Thank you, Maddie. Good afternoon and welcome to Johnson Consulting Conversations, Insider Perspectives and Stories. I'm Lacy Robinson, your host for this captivating virtual event. Each month, we dive into stimulating discussions and share valuable insights. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the next 45 minutes as we uncover stories and strategies that both inspire and enlighten. We are thrilled to welcome Nelson Thulin, Director of Business Consulting for Johnson Consulting Group, to discuss business success in 2025. Nelson is a seasoned funeral service professional with over 30 years of experience. Throughout his career, he has gained invaluable experience transitioning from an independent owner to a corporate leader and working with both single and multi-location operations. Welcome, Nelson. We are delighted to have you.
Well, Lacy, I'm just thrilled to be here with you. And that's a little bit too big of an opening for me, but I'll try to live up to it.
No opening is big enough for you, Nelson. It's always a pleasure to work with you. And again, for our audience, a friendly reminder, if you have questions, drop those into the chat feature and we'll discuss those at the end. And to begin our discussion, I want us to get into the fundamental aspects of budgeting, which is analyzing historical and year-to-date data. And understanding these figures is crucial to projecting that future activity for all funeral homes. And Nelson, I want you to share recommendations for funeral home owners reviewing and analyzing that data effectively.
So probably the biggest thing is just to be honest with yourself. A lot of times we'll get into those pie in the sky expectations or the hope and the dream that for some reason this year will be different than the last 10 years before. But to track that information, track information, that's the critical part. And sometimes it doesn't have to be super sophisticated, just consistent. And so that you can compare and contrast variances. That's really in the long run what you're looking at for trends and the variation to those trends, and with the additional data that you have to dig down and find out what the root cause of those trends are. And again, you can do it with a variety of things. I come from the old days where it was just a spiral bound notebook and we would track our market share and things like that. But to be able to understand the layers of your business, not just call volume, but what the changes in that call volume is, what those calls represent to your business economically from the revenue and as well as the cost of conducting those services.
And I'm glad you mentioned consistency over sophistication. That is something to remember, that consistency is key to making those realistic projections for 2025, and it certainly will ensure informed and sustainable decision making. Having a grasp on the overall call volume, the next step is to break it down further. Can you share a few strategies for projecting the total call volume per call classification?
Yes, and that's critical. In fact, let me share something with you. I can screen here. I'll talk over the top of it here. But you know. So I don't know how well you can see this, but this is a relatively rudimentary format. And some people may look at it like, holy cats, how much stuff are you collecting there? But the reason that you want this level of detail is it's more than just one call volume. Oh, we did 300 calls last year. We're doing 300 calls again this year. Or burial versus cremation, or pre-need versus burial cremation. And because each one of those has a significant independent effect on the overall revenue, as well as the changes. And that's what we were talking about, to be able to track consistently month over month, quarter over quarter, and in this case, when we're talking budgets, annually. But to understand those shifts within the calls, you could do 300 calls every single year for 10 years. And that typically wouldn't be a good sign, because there's organic growth that happens every community. And that alone would represent a growth that, if you're not seeing that, if you do have a company and you're saying, gosh, we do 300 calls every year and we're just as steady Eddie as you'd want to be. But the truth of the matter is, organic death rates grow at about 1.2% per year. And so if you had a 300 call funeral home, you should annually see about 3 or 4 additional calls a year, just organically. And then over time, over a 3-year period, that'd be anywhere from 9 to 12 additional calls. So you can imagine, if you were happy at 300 calls year over year, but then you realize that you should actually be at, 312, 315, whatever that is, your market is growing whether you are or not. And a lot of that is whether or not you know what the market share for your competition is. But back to the screen here, the reason that you want to look at these is to understand what is happening within those numbers. Is it changing from burial to cremation? Are your pre-needs becoming more of a relevant part of your overall call volume? And what does that mean? Do your pre-need averages keep up with your at-need averages? What is the trend of the arrangements that are being made in a pre-need, and how is that going to affect you in the future? A lot of very big companies, they look at that from the forecasting perspective, that national averages, a pre-need will mature in 6 to 7 years. So there's a lot of companies, large companies, will look at that, and they'll be able to estimate what the case mix is going to look like and what their call volume may trend to be, years in advance, and be making those gradual adjustments over time, instead of suddenly being slapped in the face with some reality that maybe we ignored or just failed to accept. And now you're making, radical changes to adjust and keep up for the revenue that isn't coming in any longer.
And I want our audience to take away and remember that word steady, that it doesn't necessarily mean that 2025 is going to be great. It's important to break down, what does steady mean? What are those classifications? And with those projections in hand, external factors such as market competition and advertising efforts certainly play a significant role. How do new competitors or increased advertising impact the overall call volume predictions?
Well, there's a lot of rule of thumbs that you can go out there. There's going to always be a new novelty to anything, and it's maybe different when you think about restaurants versus funeral homes. But what is the factor that you can actually calculate? And all businesses worldwide use this number, but it is very relevant for funeral homes, and that's a net promoter score. So obviously, Johnson Consulting, one of the largest survey companies out there, and we track that very carefully for all of our clients, as well as a composite of the whole country. But net promoter score, if you're not familiar with it, it's a response a post-funeral family gives to, would I return to this funeral home if I needed their services again? And would I recommend a family member or friend to go there? That is a forecaster unlike anything else, because it's basically telling you their loyalty and their commitment to support and promote your brand. There's a saying that if you want to look at the health of your company, look at your sales. But if you want to look at the health of your future, look at your net promoter score. And here's probably an interesting thing for everybody to consider. For every one of us that have ever come back from a long day of funerals and somebody said, "Oh, how'd everything go?" "Oh, just fine. Everybody was satisfied." Satisfied is a great thing. There's no doubt about it. Nothing went wrong. But we know from net promoter scores that people that are simply satisfied are also susceptible to competition. Somebody new, somebody that's providing a service that they'd never even heard of before, or maybe a nicer building or something like that. The net promoter scores, it goes from 0 to 10. Nines and tens are advocate families. Those are the ones that would absolutely return. They talk about returning regardless of price, that customer satisfaction is more important to them than price. And interesting enough, people that rate sevens and eights, which you would think, again, they're satisfied, they paid you some money and you did the services and everything went fine. But those are exactly the families that are open to other opportunities. If somebody else, they're talking at the water cooler and they're sharing stories about, yeah, I just had a family member that died and we had this kind of funeral, sounds just like it was for yours. And then they find out it was $1,000 cheaper. Those are the ones that are open to looking at, well, if I get the same service and the same quality of everything, why not save $1,000? So that's the biggest thing, is if you have a way of tracking and finding out from your families what that is. And then we'll probably talk more. I'll save some more comments, but if we get into things like promotion online, and that's a trend that's grown dramatically through the pandemic and beyond. We see families now that tell us that 20% of the people research their choice of funeral home online, whereas in the past, it was usually, you'd ask somebody and find out. Now people are actively researching their choices online.
And we would be remiss if we didn't mention those new funeral home owners that come into town and they hit the ground running. And we want to definitely recognize that that can certainly impact call volume. And I'm glad you brought up the word satisfaction. Satisfied families is not enough. Was that a short-term satisfied family or a long-term satisfied family? And we're working towards making sure the family experiences long-term satisfaction. I want to transition from call volume and look at another critical component, average sales calls per call classification. What are the key elements to consider when reviewing average sales in various categories, such as traditional burial and cremation services?
Well, again, going back to what we were talking about as far as tracking things, it's one, just to know the number of calls you're doing and what your average sale is and things like that. But it's so critical to really pinpoint what your sales are going to be, what your revenues are going to be, and to do it with some specificity that it allows you to make big decisions. A lot of times people hold back on making big decisions. Should we do this? Should we remodel that? Should we replace the chairs and the chapel and things? You're getting feedback from families that maybe things look a little bit dilapidated, but can we really afford to do a complete overhaul to the funeral home? While you ponder those questions because you don't know what your revenues are going to look like the next year, you only let the circumstances get worse, and it kind of has that vicious cycle where people are telling you you need to make changes or adjustments, and you're afraid to do it because you're really not aware of what the future is going to look like. By going through these steps, and again, to track what your sales are by these various service types is critical, because you don't see it happen instantaneously. It's like a slow burn over time. But what we've seen now over the last few years is, 2% change from burial to cremation. And one time a year, okay, well, 2%, what does that really represent? 3 or 4 calls or something like that. But then year over year over year, you see that 2%. And what we see then between those numbers is like, nationally speaking, probably about a $4,000 difference between burials to cremations. And then even there, if you have, 100 burials this year, but do you know how many of them were pre-needs versus a true at-need call? Because we see that those as well will have sometimes up to a $1,500 difference between a pre-need burial that, for whatever reason, whether it hasn't kept up with the funding vehicle, or maybe the pre-arrangements were done by somebody that, they didn't really offer up everything, and maybe it was just to secure the sale, and now the family comes in with a reduced level of service. We need to understand and know that if over time we're going to be seeing burial services that are impacted by a pre-need that's increasing, but it's the revenue from that is going down $1,500 every time. All of those independent numbers go into that form that I shared before, and we'll provide that free. Anybody that wants to use that, are interested in tracking their numbers, be happy to share that with them. But to be able to take that number and those changes, and then the multiplication of those to see what your revenue is. It's one thing just to say, well, I'm going to raise my prices to match inflation. But if you aren't also raising your prices to match reduction in revenue because of case shift mix, you're going to be going backwards.
You bring up a great point earlier about never assume when things start to shift, because families are exposed, and they learn about these different types of services, and they have more options than ever before, whether it's green burial or natural reduction. And we don't want to go into 2025 assuming anything in that regard. What we do know is that price adjustments can significantly influence sales projections. How can the changes in pricing affect the projection of average sales per call classification?
Well, that's a great question. And in fact, it's something that we're consulting with our clients all the time. Is for years and years, we always looked at the direct cremation kind of as that lowest level common denominator with all our competitors in a community, because really at the end of the day, there's not a lot of variation off of a direct cremation, especially if you interpret it exactly like the FTC does. Whether you have a beautiful, you know, grand building, or you have a relatively modest storefront operation, you're asking that family to pay for essentially the same service. So oftentimes, funeral homes would leave that price alone because I need to compete with that discount operation, or somebody that maybe can do it a little bit more efficiently and cost effectively because they don't have the kind of building and staff that I do. Unfortunately, years and years ago, you could subsidize that price range because you had, 70% burial. That was maybe probably $6,000 or $7,000 more. You do one burial, and that can help subsidize the losses you take from a lot of direct cremations. But now we've gotten to the point where there are just not enough burial services to subsidize 60% rate of direct cremation. And so it's really important that we look at each service and calculate what it really does cost us to conduct. We talk about it in our conversations at Johnson Consulting as a recovery cost, that everybody should have a basic understanding of what is the basic number of dollars that you have to render from that service just to pay for that service, just the overhead. And it's not the overhead we think about in a GPL, but what it costs us in terms of labor and other variables, but all the fixed cost. Funeral services is unique in that, is that the vast majority of our services are relatively fixed. So if your call volume is going down, your fixed prices per service are going up. And in the same token, if your case mix is changing from a burial, which might be averaging $6,000 or $7,000, to a cremation that might be averaging $3,000, now you have an ever increasing um, recovery cost and an ever reducing revenue cost to try to pay for that. And that's where you just can't stick with the old tried and true, well, we'll just add $100 to everything and go forward. It's just not a realistic application of what the pricing should be on those.
And you dropped a little nugget there, Nelson, labor expenses. And I know that is top of mind of many of our audience members. And I want us to take a look at labor expenses and look at what steps should be taken to project those labor expenses, including salaries, overtime, training, and benefits for full-time employees.
Yeah, it is certainly a part of the calculation. You might hear me reference it as kind of the perfect storm. There's three unique uh, portions of what we look at when we're considering what the future in any business is going to look like. And labor in funeral service is certainly the top consideration. What we do based upon our accounting division and our merger and acquisition division, we have the opportunity to see a lot of financials over the course of last 18, well, I think we're coming up on actually 24, 25 years. So in looking at those and seeing those trends over time, we have developed what we refer to as a benchmark of industry standards for expenses. Another thing that I can show that to you in a little while, and that would be another thing if anybody wants at the end of this, just reach out and be happy to share that with them. But in doing that, we know now that labor expenses on average throughout funeral service has now raised to somewhere between like 38 and 40% of revenue. So you think that's a huge chunk of dollars that are going just to man and provide for the labor and care to take care of those families. And I'm not begrudging anybody. We probably should. I think Jake talks about it as being more of a correction, and that we've got licensed professionals that, in order to maintain their satisfaction within their profession, they're going to need to have a comparable wage to what other professionals do out there. And so that's a major factor, not only in doing that, but then evaluating and treating people consistent with what their production is. There's ICP programs, incentive compensation plans, that can help owners do exactly that, is to level the playing field from the standpoint of it's difficult sometimes to allocate raises out to individuals, and I'm going to give this person 5% or that person only 2%. You can do it in a big company, but it's sometimes hard when everybody's working very closely together, and some people have bad feelings if they get shortchanged. The truth of the matter is, it goes both ways, though. A hardworking, really devoted, dedicated employee, if they don't see that they can move forward in their career, that everybody else benefits just as much as they do, despite that they're going above and beyond. That's difficult too. There's a saying that the most unequal thing is to treat unequals equally, because it will, demotivate those people that are trying, and it certainly isn't going to motivate the person that's just going through the motions. But ICP plans, we can work on that and take the things that owners want to drive, customer service, sales averages, and things like that, and help promote a better living for those that are interested in the growth of the funeral home.
You mentioned Johnson Consulting has, decades of data from funeral home clients across the country. I'm coming up on being a trainer in funeral service for nearly 20 years. We understand the importance of training, and we can see the positive impact that training has on employees. Let's say we have a funeral home that has 4 full-time licensed funeral directors, 1 pre-need specialist, and perhaps 6 part-time associates. What is the frame of mind that a funeral home owner or manager needs to have when considering training in 2025?
Well, I think about it like an investment rather than an expense. Let's just go back to the cost of operations. We said before that labor is 40% of the cost of operations. From that same data, I can tell you that vehicles are like 3%, facilities are somewhere between 6 and 9%. So even the two of them together, you say somewhere between 9 and 15%. And yet we don't think twice about, oh, you know what, we have to upgrade our chapels, we got to rotate out our vehicles, we got to, improve our facilities. And yet that most vitally important aspect, and certainly the most expensive part of our entire program, is the people that work there, human beings that if they're doing a job, you cannot replace them. Something we talk about in customer service, in that funeral homes don't vary that much from what they do from place to place, and maybe their facilities and things like that. But the one thing that you can always guarantee is that they don't have a Mary and they don't have a Jim down the way. And if your Mary or your Jim is a fantastic funeral director or a wonderful support team member, there is no greater value than that, because they cannot be duplicated by your competition. And we should always be thinking about investing in them and growing them. One, we talk about recruiting is huge, but retention is right there as well. If you're an owner and you think that your team is safe and secure, you're, again, one of those things: be honest, be truthful for yourself. Everybody in funeral service, if they don't own the facility, have been contacted within the last couple of years about a job somewhere else. And when they're thinking about that, one of the things, again, satisfaction plays into that consumer relationship too, because not only do people want to have satisfaction in the services that they get from you, but they want to have satisfaction in the life and the work that they're doing in your funeral homes, and to constantly be helping them evolve and develop. So training is a big part of that investment, helping them grow, letting them know that if they're dedicating the next 30 years of their life to your operations, maybe they're not going to own a place of their own. They want to be able to be assured of the fact that 30 years from now, I can look back on a career of taking care of families and be very proud of what I've done, but also know that I'm able to retire and have a decent life that way too. So we really, really have to invest, and that's for training of all natures, as well as making sure that they're adequately compensated. I will add this one thing in too. We do business assessments all over the country. We get called in and we spend a few days there interviewing everybody and looking at every aspect of the funeral home or cemetery operation. And time again, the one thing that both ownership and staff equally agree upon is there's not enough training. And you would think that, they wouldn't necessarily look at that from the same perspective, and maybe they don't, but they do have the same outcome, is that the people want more training, and the ownership usually feels as though they need more training. So again, you're in high demand for what people should be.
The question I get asked the most when I'm setting up training sessions, whether it's virtual or in person with a funeral home client, is should I invite part-time associates to the training? And I always reply, absolutely invite them. This information is crucial to how they provide excellent customer service to every single family they come in contact with. Part-time associates, I know firsthand that they are hungry for training. They want new information. They want to learn skills that's going to help them be better in their job. We know that part-time associates, they play an important role in operations. How can a funeral home effectively project expenses for part-time employees considering the variable hours and rates?
Well, good. It's a good question. Part-time people, I've said this for the 30 some years, I guess it's closing in on 40 years. Funeral service is unique in that it really can't function at the levels that it needs to periodically without that influx of part-time employees. To be able to call somebody that's willing to come in, sometimes with very short notice, and they supply their own uniform for the most part, and they treat and conduct themselves as though they themselves were the owners. That is not an easy thing to come by, and it shouldn't be taken lightly. It's the same thing there too, is to look at the investment into that part-time. And I think in many respects, it's going to be different in the way that you do supplement them. They aren't going to have health care. They're probably not going to have some of the benefits like time and days off and things like that. But you certainly think about what they want. We talk about Ford, give everybody a little bit of our customer experience training, but Ford stands for family, occupation, recreation, and dreams. And for a lot of our part-time workers, especially the elderly ones, the dollars aren't even as important sometimes as just the social engagement that they have working at the funeral home. I've been a part of a lot of focus groups with part-time folks. And as you go around the room, I can guarantee you the wage, which is, again, usually not that great, it isn't the motivator. For most of the people, there's the value in being a part of something bigger than they are, doing something in their community that makes a difference. Find those things out. You'd be surprised that sometimes the greatest incentives have nothing to do with dollars at all. They have to do with the value and the meaning. Where we see that in surveys of newer, younger employees, many of them as well look at what does it mean to work for the organization that I work for? Is there meaning to what I do? Of course, everybody wants the dollars, and nobody would turn down a raise, but we can't we can't get lost in the fact that just throwing dollars at people will ultimately make the difference. It's a quality of life, and it's also a consideration and appreciation. And sometimes, again, we do surveys, and you'd be surprised how often somebody will say, it's nice when our boss just out of the blue brings in pizzas and stuff when we're busy. Those kind of things are what we need to be doing, more engaged with our employees and what the work environment is like, and adjusting accordingly, trying to make it an uplifting, meaningful experience for our employees.
And while part-time associates may not be motivated by money, they're looking for meaningful work. If that work is not there, or if they've not received a call from an owner to come and work at the funeral home for a little bit, they may be looking elsewhere for opportunities. And I want to turn our conversation to operational expenses. Maintaining facilities is essential. What are the best practices for reviewing and projecting maintenance and repair expenses for funeral home facilities?
The one thing I think, yeah, you're going to hear me say that over and over again, but the value of tracking. And in this case, it's not geared around, pluses and minuses and things like that, but just observing, taking a slow stroll around the facilities, doing annual, if not quarterly, facility review. What I used to find that was, enlightening is that a former owner would come back every 6, 7 months or something like that. And gosh, they would walk around the building and say, this is wrong and that is wrong. And a lot of people are like, well, everything's bad. But really what it was is that they just weren't used to that lampshade that, over time has a hole in it and nobody notices it. Being aware of your facilities and really taking time, if you're fortunate enough, if you're in an organization where you've got maybe 2 facilities or more, bring people from the other facilities around and ask them to really be brutally honest. And, when's the last time you changed the flag out front? Because it's all frayed. And I'll tell you what, a veteran driving by, that is not going to leave them with a good impression of your operations with a frayed flag out front. But that's what we need is the hard, cold reality of somebody really looking at us closely. Talking about new people on our staff, I think apprentices or anybody brand new to the staff has a very unique opportunity and generally a very small window of time where they're going to be looking at your building and your operations from the perspective of the community and your consumers. When you have that, I always used to instruct anybody that was brand new to our staff, this is your role in looking at us and giving us some very candid feedback about, I noticed that you do this and why do you do that? I just don't understand. And if our response is because we've always done it that way, or, that's how my great grandma thought it looked good, those are the things that we should be reevaluating. There's another, I can maybe as you ask the next question, I can bring up another form here.
I do want to recommend enlisting the help of a professional mystery shopper to come in during visitations, during funerals, during non-busy hours to take a look around, look at the furniture, look at the cleanliness, the level of hospitality offered by associates, and especially those restrooms. But a professional mystery shopper can certainly give you the feedback that you need moving forward and making repairs and updating.
That's a great point. And I made a comment before about what we do for our businesses. And when we go on scene, we'll do that. A lot of times, like when we go to a cemetery, I like to do this because you can walk around and I'll go in there maybe the day ahead of time or the morning before and just take pictures. And oftentimes during the presentation, all I do is just sit back quiet and say, I'm just going to give you a pictorial review of what I've seen as I looked around the grounds and stuff like that. And I'll tell you what, some people hang their head pretty low, and it's not that it's anything bad, it's just the things that they've become accustomed to. And when they're asked to really look at it from the lens of the consumer, it all of a sudden has a whole different look. The things that are tattered or the handwritten signs on the door that maybe were done out of quick convenience, but they look shabby and unprofessional and things like that. So yeah, anytime that you can get that, again, to have somebody that can do something like that, a lot like shopper training, where you can have a secret shopper that calls up and listens. It's the same idea to get that fresh eye perspective. Something that I've thrown up on this, I've mentioned this before about this industry standards for expenses. This is not necessarily something that somebody should look at and say, oh my goodness, my prices, my expenses don't align with this, but it will give you some guidelines. Just for instance, like the cost of goods, you'll see a range there. A funeral home that is heavily cremation orientated is going to be on the lower end of that because they're obviously not buying a lot of caskets. Personnel, same thing too, depending upon if you have a staff that's filled with people that have been there for 30 and 35 years, you might be beyond that 40% range because of the accumulated salaries over time. But and again, this is something if anybody wants to, after the webinar is over, ask for this. It's something that's valuable when you do put your budget together and you start comparing what your expenses are to revenue. It at least gives you a sense on, oh gosh, I probably should work on that area first, because it'll give you some kind of benchmark to gauge your own operations against.
And I see automotive on there. Vehicle related cost is another major expense. How should funeral homes analyze and project vehicle related expenses, including maintenance, repairs, and insurance?
Yeah, so for most people, they have the decision on whether or not do I lease or do I own. And the comparison of that, again, we talk about tracking and comparing, and to know what your standardized cost would be for a lease versus I have this vehicle that I own, and the fact that, well, I can sell it and get whatever remaining equity is left in it. But am I taking into account that if I have that hearse or that limousine, I also need to have a person that drives it. I also have to have the insurance to cover it. I do have to do the oil changes and the gas and everything like that. For anything where you're making a budgetary decision, it's to do those comparisons or then track on your vehicles. Sometimes we can get lulled in the fact that a hearse that looks, just fine, but it's 10 years old, and any vehicle, whether it's driven 30 miles or 300,000 miles, time will play a factor into it, and it will wear and tear and break down and things like that. If all of a sudden from one year to the next, you double in maintenance repairs, that's something that's not going to get better, and throwing money at it is going to stem the tide, but it's going to come back. And so those are the things that, again, if you're tracking and watching and managing your not only your vehicles but your buildings, deferred maintenance a lot of times happens when people are getting ready to sell a location, but if it doesn't happen and now you're stuck with roof repairs or chimney tuck pointing that when it didn't get done, now all of a sudden the chimney fell over on you. All of that plays into maintenance and monitoring and tracking your numbers. And the numbers will tell you a lot. Years ago, I came in fresh to a building that I was going to be managing, and the water expense seemed really crazily high to me. And we checked. I asked everybody there, and they just kind of shrugged their shoulders and said, "No, we just that was what it was." Anyhow, we looked into it some more, found out from the city came out and did a free inspection because they also agreed that the water was high. Here we had what do I want to say, a sprinkler system, one of the main supply lines right next to the building underneath the big sweeping porch was just pouring out water right along the foundation of the building. So not only were we spending a lot of extra money on water, but it was damaging the building, and the numbers were there to tell us that something was wrong, and for a long time nobody was paying attention to it. So again, track, watch, be consistent, look for your variances. A lot of times the business will tell you what it needs.
And I have one last question for you, Nelson. You and I have talked in the past that the old days of community outreach, going to the Rotary Club meetings, it does not have the same impact as today. And I want you to share with our audience, what do funeral homes need to review and adjust when it comes to advertising and promotion budgets in order to stay competitive?
Yeah, that's a tough transition. I still run into funeral homes where they'll say, everybody on our team has to pick a local community group to be involved with. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think any kind of involvement is good. You're going to make connections and relationships that are going to pay off. But in a day and age where you got to look at what your return on investment is, and if you're paying for somebody to be part of Rotary and go to the weekly lunches and stuff like that. And if it's not producing anything, you're going to get into a tight bind and you're going to look at your budget and you're going to say, is it really worth sending, Fred there to the Rotary every week when nothing's coming out of it? And that's when we do look at, social media, what impacts our involvement in the community, where can we draw interest from other people that are already out there and engaged. And that's where I always tell people, look at what's in your community and, jump on a bandwagon. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. And for funeral service, it's not always the easiest thing to match up with something. But over the years, I've seen some tremendous programming, and now it's only benefited by the fact that you can, cross-link things that you are putting on your website about the involvement of your staff in different community events, and then link to those groups, whether it be an Alzheimer's group. When you think about funeral service, we're all about preserving memories, and that's what Alzheimer's is trying to find a cure for, is people losing their memories. And all the other things out there, organ donation, those families, they understand what's gone into providing for organ donation. Somebody had to die, and funeral homes are uniquely equipped to help those families, not only in the restoration part of it, but in the grief recovery after that. They know and understand and appreciate your role and what you do and play. But connect with those. Think about the people that match up to your brand identity, because that's something that nowadays promoting it on the internet, social media is going to be a big factor of growing your brand and your reputation, because you already have these organizations that have thousands of followers, and it's just much more efficient for you to align yourself with organizations that are already out there. And it's so easy to do through social media nowadays.
Thank you for bringing up aligning with other businesses. They are certainly poised and ready to grow their market share in 2025, and would definitely benefit from a funeral home partnering with them in any type of way. I want to check in with Maddie on any questions that have come through the chat feature that Nelson can answer.
We don't have any questions at the moment. However, we did have a shout out for Performance Tracker. Thank you, Carla. Implementing Performance Tracker has been an invaluable source of data for our business. So we always love a good little shout out there for PTX.
Thank you for that.
At the risk of being a shameless promoter, Performance Tracker does help you generate all those reports and all that tracking. If you're like thinking, Nelson, it'd be great to track all that, but I got enough just to get, my family obits into the newspaper and things like that. Performance Tracker is set up so it aligns with your point of sale system. So when you're putting the information in that you have to put in anyhow to, generate everything for your business, it automatically will download that and put all of that information at the click of a finger for things like if you want to understand what your case mix is, you can generate that and see where it's changing and how it's being affected. You can look at data with regards to contract performance and where we are struggling. You know, do we have a discount issue? And if we do, is it lying with maybe one or two arrangers or one or two different case types where we're discounting them dramatically just to make them competitive? It's that kind of data and that ability to track that oftentimes within real time or certainly month to month. It is, thank you, Carla, because it is a tremendous help for anybody that's busy and yet wants to track where their business is going. Hence the name, performance.
And
track.
from the perspective of the trainer, that data helps us make changes to a particular program or training workshop that's going to best fit their needs and helps us identify opportunities for growth and implementing new skills and enhancing existing skills. It's very beneficial to have that data going into training. I want to thank Nelson for joining us on our second Johnson Consulting Conversations. You've given us insights that funeral home owners can navigate with their financial planning, having confidence with that heading into 2025, ensuring sustainable and successful operations. If you know someone who did not get to attend our live show today, please feel free to share with them the link to the recording and also the blog summary post that will be available tomorrow. And also in that follow-up email, there's going to be a link to our year-end promotion that includes a comprehensive year-end business review and financial forecast. Our next Johnson Consulting Conversation is December the 11th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And Nelson, would you like to share any final words with our audience?
Again, when you think about planning ahead for your funeral, for your funeral home and your business, tracking where you've been, where you are now, will give you a big insight as to what the future is. I think, we're coming up on 2025, and if you thought back to 2000 and 2020, and you thought, were there a lot of things that have happened between 2020 and 25 that you couldn't have possibly predicted? Yeah, the whole world spun on a dime. But think about all the things that if you could have predicted them, that you would have made some different changes. So looking ahead shouldn't be a scary thing. And in fact, you can do it with a great deal of confidence when you look behind you and see where you've come, because it is going to be the trajectory of your business. And whether that's going up or down, obviously we all want to see it going up. But if it is going down, it is not an inevitability. You've got all the resources and possibilities at your availability as long as you're tracking and looking at them, and you'll find the answers inside the details. There probably are no silver bullets, but we talk about in our leadership management programs all the time that there's probably 100 small changes that you can make that will inevitably have an impact on your business. So it's important to be looking at all those and making the adjustments as you go along.
100 small changes will certainly make a difference, especially if you start those small changes now leading into 2025. Thank you, Nelson, for being a part of Johnson Consulting Conversation. And thank you to everyone who joined us this afternoon. We hope to see you December the 11th at 2 p.m.
Thank you, Lacy.